I'm going to talk now about the relationships among analysts. It's a tough topic, an interesting topic, difficult to explore. Let me put it into context by saying first that this is a historical paper that I wrote in 1960, only 46 years ago. And I co-wrote it with Bernardo Arensburg because he was a good friend of mine, and he added the dimension of having been trained in Paris when the French Analytic Society split into the French and the Paris Society, and having had severe conflicts among analysts. So he had returned to Santiago after training in Paris, and I invited him to be the co-writer of this paper that we then presented in the third Latin American Congress of Psychoanalysis that was held in Santiago in December of 1960. There was a panel devoted to relationships among analysts. The panelists were Marie Langer, an Austrian who was trained in Vienna by Richard Sturba, like Kosawa, and she had moved to Argentina and had trained several analysts there, among others Racker and others. So the panelists were Marie Langer, Valderedo Ismael de Oliveira, who was from Rio de Janeiro, Leon Grimberg from Buenos Aires also, and myself together with Bernardo Arensburg, the co-authors of the paper I'm presenting. This panel was agreed as one of the main topics of that Congress after the experience of the split that was about to happen of the Argentinian Psychoanalytic Society. They have tried to study the difficulties in the relationships among analysts and have organized during 1959, the year before the Congress, a symposium that was very well attended in Buenos Aires and many other countries. We sent delegates, I attended it, and the attempt in that symposium in '59 was to prevent the split that they thought it was coming, like a family that feels that the parents are going to get divorced, and the children got together to try to avoid it. Well, in France, the same story had happened. In many societies, as you know, there have been splittings and new splittings, and this makes the topic both interesting, appealing, difficult, and we have to be cautious not to end up in being like, how to say, washing in public the dirty linen and cultivating gossips and denigration of our professional image among ourselves or vis-a-vis the public. So, Arensburg and myself approached the topic, and in that sense I'm going to be historic, and this is a summary and translation of a paper of about 40 pages that we wrote then, and I'm mainly going to base this part of the exposition on this paper. Later on in the discussion I'll try to update it. In our paper we use three different viewpoints to write on the topic. One, a social psychological viewpoint. Second, a group dynamics viewpoint. Third, psychoanalytic observations of individual reactions according to the status within the analytic organization. So let me start by these socio-psychological aspects of the psychoanalytic societies. We wrote that the first analysts were progressive people who were innovators, that following Freud non-conformism with the prevailing organicistic approach to psychiatry were looking for psychological aspects, mainly under the influence of Freud and his exploration and discovery of the unconscious, that were indeed revolutionary in their ideology, innovating against the traditional viewpoint of psychiatry or that were organized around an organicistic viewpoint. So in some way they were somehow ostracized. Freud did not have access to the university. Freud had tremendous difficulty to get finally appointed in some kind of peripheral way to the staff of the university in Vienna. My point is they were in some way innovators, and in that sense they were somehow revolutionary ideology. They cultivated an ideology that changed the picture, that was accepted by the establishment. Some of these innovators tended to innovate inside their environment, their organizational, societal environment, and in that sense, they were somehow potentially a threat to the group cohesiveness. Let's say the tendency, let's say, of Jung, Carl Jung, or Adler, or Ferenczi to try to innovate, doing it within the ideology of the psychoanalytic circle, being innovators internally, created turmoil in the analytic group, and Jung and Adler ended up being extruded, kicked out of this inner circle as heretics, so to say, or innovators whose development of theory and technique were unacceptable by the, let's say, orthodox analytic internal group. The same can be said of Ferenczi or Franz Alexander. Each one of these four names representing different variations of innovation of the internal group and different degrees of being accepted or not accepted by the whole community of analysts. All the innovators could be focused on external organizations beyond the analytic group, and in some way became somehow let's say warriors in a fight against the external group that was opposed to analysis. And in some way, all of this contributed to a sense of confusion of the concept of good as equivalent of healthy, or healthy as equivalent of being right and good, and by opposition, the concept of illness as being sick equals being bad, and therefore feeling guilty about being sick, in some way promoting the lack of acceptance of our own conflicts by trying to use the external group as the recipient of projections. The other one is the sick. The psychiatrists are crazy. We analysts have analyzed ourselves and have become quote unquote healthy somehow. Well, and the other viewpoint that we used to study these phenomena was the group dynamic ones, in which I insisted in bringing in Wilfred Bion's observations of the group dynamics, distinguishing between the group work, which is the rational group equivalent to the normal ego that is oriented toward the reality of the task to perform by the group, in contrast to the primitive group that is more comparable to the unconscious system, where emotions prevail and there's a lack of logic and a lack of rationality. well, bringing in these ideas of beyond to explain the group dynamics of our analytic organizations, it's obvious that we had idealized, and up to the moment, Sigmund Freud as omnipotent creator of our ideas and our organizations, developing something like a very special relationship between the founding father and its followers. And this created like an initial symbiotic relationship comparable to the symbiosis between mother and child, according to Mahler's description of the symbiotic phase, with the founder, either Freud or the founder of any small group that is beginning, either in Tampa or in Chile, a symbiotic relationship, mutual dependency between the founder and his or her candidates, with the tendency of both to depend upon each other to succeed and begin to spread analysis in a community. Practically, the power to psychoanalyze that begins being in the hands or in the brains of Sigmund Freud extended to his disciples. He granted them the power to also psychoanalyze once they had gotten the minimum training that were initially described as the minimum in those years. Kosawa from Japan stayed 4 months in Vienna being analyzed by Serva and became a training analyst in Tokyo. But there we have the example, concrete one, of how the symbiosis between Freud and his followers function to spread analysis to Asia, for instance. But in this symbiotic relationship, both partners may be, on the one hand, run the risk of over depending on the other partner, and on the other hand, very easily feel robbed, dominated, or exploited by the partner. And both may fear the winning, the separation from the partner, and in some way, on the other hand, because of intense ambivalence, they may want to get rid of the partner and get rid of the symbiotic relationship a bit more on their own, as if it were. In this symbiotic relationship, the natural tendency is and was for the founder to choose who would be the founder's successor. And as you know from the history of the analytic movement, Freud had founded the successor in Carl Jung, and Jung became his preferred disciple, and Freud, promoted Jung as the one who would succeed him. And during the first two psychoanalytic international congresses, Jung was the prince who would succeed the king, eliciting all kinds of jealousy and hostility among the Viennese colleagues that were tremendously feel displaced by Freud's preference of this foreigner, this Swiss guy, Goy, and top of not being Jewish, from Switzerland, and then having tremendous religious, as a son of a minister, religious ideology. This provoked, in beyond terminology, a change from a basic assumption of dependency in the symbiotic period of depending upon Freud to a climate of a basic assumption of fight and flight, with some members of the Viennese society moving out of the society, some creating a rebellion against Freud and Jung's influence. Adler, in spite of his somehow personal limitations and being ideologically too much of a Marxist, as you know, succeeded, in spite of some limitations, in stirring up the pot in the Viennese society and became the leader of the fight against Freud's selection of Jung as the official to become king after him. In the middle of this paranoid atmosphere of internal war, of civil war if you want, the paranoia was such that it led to the organization of the secret committee, as you know, in Jones' biography of Freud, the 5 Praetorian Guard that were to run their lives, risk their life to protect Freud, and who created this symbol of the ring and being a ring of protection, of protectors of Freud to defend him, with the scapegoating of the dissidents as being the bad guys that had to be extruded, demonized, or in some way excommunicated. Of course, all these historic facts and interpretations along the lines of Dion's concept of fluid dynamics are on the one hand history, and on the other hand are a metaphor, as history many times can be used to what may happen now in probably every analytic society of the world, in which the current situation is that there's a series of ongoing conflicts among analysts. I don't need to be more obvious, the implications are obvious themselves. It so happened in general that large psychoanalytic societies, different from yours in Tampa or the one I am in Atlanta, not comparable to, let's say, London or Los Angeles or New York or Chicago or Paris or Rio de Janeiro or Buenos Aires. In large analytic societies, they are often divided into various families. Families led, each one of them, by the training analysts who trained the members of that family, and it's like a symbolic parent. And the relationships among the families are ones of fight and mistrust for power and prestige, loaded with political undertones, in which jealousy and rival may become sometimes very intense, and the splitting between the bad guys and the good guys can become very, very much intense, and in some way is comparable to the struggles and rivalry of the families in Verona in Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, like Montagues and Capulets swearing to kill each other and finding partners to implement the killing. In some way, each family becomes an enemy of the other families. This creates a very complex relationship within societies, with each candidate becoming, on the one hand, her own or his own self, on the other hand, being perceived, oh, this belongs to the family of such and such. And in that sense, may be a secret source of information to spy about what's going on in the other family. And the supervision meetings can be used to try to get information, to extract news about the secrets. And the same can happen in the middle of the isolation of the analyst, working by her himself in his or her office, than getting a candidate that from the couch tells you about what he has heard that's going on in other families, and the analyst pays attention, or the supervisor sometimes elicit information. There's an atmosphere that was described a long time ago by Otto Kernberg, and we use the term as he coined it, the tapped phones, like the current National Security Agency, but with the phone being the mouth of the candidate on the couch, associating freely and bringing up gossipy material, or the supervisee that can be invited in the middle of talking about the case that supervisee is supposed to present. The supervisor may stop the dialogue about the case and ask him questions about the family and about the gossips that are circulating in the corridors as a way of getting, quote, secret information. This all creates an atmosphere of paranoia, of fears of revenge, accusations of abuse of power. In one of these societies that I had the duty of becoming a member of a site visit committee, one of the analysts there became famous because this person acted like the secret police, like the FBI, like J. Edward Hoover, accumulating all the rotten, awful informations about the others and having a file of them, like Fouché, this character that Stefan Zweig studied in France, who survived from the king that was decapitated, to Napoleon by being the chief of the police in France and accumulating all the rotten information of everybody by threatening everybody. I tell you about the dirty secrets. He kept himself afloat across many changes of regimes in France. In the same way the FBI used in the United States his access to dirty secrets as the basis of his power for years. In one of the societies I acted as part of a site visit committee, one supervisor managed to use the supervision to get all the dirty information that this person could get from their supervisees. It was famous that the supervisions were in some way devoted at least half of the time to gathering gossip, to getting information, and this person later on threatened them. I know about whose analyst is sleeping with his patients. I have heard that. Or any other, quote, awful thing that could be accused. She accumulated these things and in some way created a power that everybody were terribly afraid of this person. Was indeed a situation in which this person was severely ill and was difficult for everyone to do something about it. Like who puts the ring bell in the hands of the cat? Who will do that? Which was part of the tragic situation that our committee was in. Some analyst, Ostro, has labeled our behavior as that of specialized barbarians, meaning that our professional knowledge about the unconscious make us amplify our paranoid fears and become victim of them. As soon as the slightest expression of hostility appears, immediately a self-reference, like in paranoid mentality, this is going on with distorted interpretation of hostility, may come against me too. And we defend against these paranoid fears that we share by taking shelter in our common ideology and idealizing it, idealizing our training, idealizing our theories, idealizing our founding fathers. And thus we deny our unconscious hostility or no analyze it significantly. and we deny our own hostility against our own training analysis, against psychoanalysis itself, with our ambivalence toward it. And in some way we do truncated analysis. Finally, we wrote with Adam's work about the individual reactions in a psychoanalytic organization as they are related to the status of the individual within the hierarchy. I wrote with some detail about the wish to become a training analyst. Often, the training analysts are the center of power in the organization, or perceived as being such. And therefore, there may be an envy and a rivalry with our own training analysts wanting to become like him or her, and this may be underanalyzed in small new groups where there is a need to have more training analysts because only one or two analysts. And in some way, rather than being analyzed and explored, the need for more training analysts may accelerate the appointment of new training analysts without having analyzed it significantly. A female medical student that was in analysis with me fantasized herself during her analysis to become herself a training analyst, and she described it as she would be taking the scepter of prestige, the crown of prestige that she perceived me as having, by becoming as omnipotent as I was perceived by her, and acting out of her envy and rivalry. She had, in the context of these fantasies, an exhibitionistic dream in which she saw herself doing striptease and provoking the sexual arousal of all the men, and as well as their anger, viewing her power and how she controlled and dominated them with her striptease activities, while in the dream herself felt disqualified as unattractive, thinking or feeling my breasts are so small, I have not enough dark breasts, and self-depreciated herself with enormous guilt feelings for her destructive and very hostile greed that wanted to be the center of the attention and power. And in the middle of this, she associated to the fears of revenge from her training analyst, from me, which inhibited her development and led her to self-depreciate herself as not having enough brain, as she thought she had too small breasts. To analyze this phenomena is very important insofar as such fantasies are stimulated by the fact that the candidate might end up indeed performing the role of a training analyst in a small society where there's a need for more training analysts. Myself, I remember a piece of my own training analysis in which these matters were associated, and I can share with you a dream that epitomizes my own fantasies and conflicts in this regard. I had a dream that I reported in one of my sessions in which I was an actor and included in a German movie, or I think it was French, that was called 5 Toms in Cairo. It was a movie that was based on the reality of General Rommel campaign in Africa during World War II. You do remember that Rommel and the Germans were dominating the war in Africa for a long time until Marshal Montgomery from England managed to defeat Rommel. But the movie was based on the fact that the Germans had prepared Rommel's campaign long before the actual war started by inventing the existence of false Egyptian tombs that were not really Egyptian tombs, but underground facilities where the Germans stored food, fuel, supplies, bullets, etc., for their armies in such a way that the whole Rommel campaign was predicated upon, in the middle of the desert in Africa, moving ahead apparently away from the rear guard that will provide them from supplies, but with the secret that they were advancing toward the 5 tombs in Cairo where the supplies were stored. So for the troops to advance had the reward of, we're going to get new supplies, man, let's go there. I had a dream in which I was involved in this, in some way surprised that we were going to get food from the tombs, and I was there, excited. It so happened that a week before, the head of the Department of Psychiatry had died. And I associated the tombs in Cairo to the tomb of the professor of psychiatry. And I associated that in my mind, likely my analyst would become the next head of the Department of Psychiatry. And I thought that this was a cycle of generations in which we're all moving towards the next tomb. And I associated, and I would become a day, you're a successor when you die, etc., etc. So my death wish of my analysts were right there, and my nose and his nose, and we analyzed how I was wishing to replace him, and in some way cannibalistically eat him in the tomb, and then identifying with him and becoming him. I'm sure I could have worked much more with these emotions than my analyst and I did, because the Chilean society needed training analysts, and I was promoted very soon to become a training analyst and in some way did a little bit of this acting out, of this dream, of these fantasies. And I think that in general probably these issues are not sufficiently analyzed. Yeah, for the candidate, the training analysts have the double role of being therapists that would help the candidate to become healthier and cure him or her of his neurosis, and a teacher. And this double role has confusing implications. Sigmund Freud warned us against the danger of thinking of ourselves as being omnipotent. On the other hand, the envious and hostile attacks against the training analyst may promote our fears of being the target of revenge, of being victimized, of being abused by the training analyst. These fantasies may later on be displaced to other members of the psychoanalytic society. The training analysts concentrate in themselves enormous power and often create an authoritarian atmosphere, ignoring the possibility of making more democratic our institutions. Teaching has become so much frequently an indoctrination, not a scientific discussion of half-truths that are constantly being renewed by criticism as they are in any science, but as dogmas that have to be memorized and kept untouched. Constructive disagreement and constant questioning that are characteristic of sciences are in some way underdone because of our tendency to idealize our theory and our training analysis. Let me digress a little bit beyond the paper by talking about the history of Heinz Koch. You do remember that his self-psychology was founded upon his complaint of his victimization and suffering during his training analysis. In his paper on the narcissistic transferences, he reported his wounds when his training analyst in a session handed up him a crown and a scepter, mocking him and telling him, yeah, this is what you want to become, a king. Here, have the crown, have the scepter. And what Koch would describe as a humiliating put down, as a cruel, sadistic confrontation. And he, around this, built up the psychology of the self and the need to be in some way recipient of empathy, not of confrontation, sadistic and demeaning, as he felt he had suffered as a trainee with his training analyst. He developed the importance then of empathy as the core of the self-psychology and at the core of the technique of self-psychology, whereby instead of analyzing aggression toward the analyst, the self-psychologist, psychoanalyst following Koch would refer the aggression back to the parents or the caregivers in childhood and be very empathic with the patient apropos of the analyst's own mistake, for which the analyst will take responsibility and apologize for his lack of empathy or her lack of empathy, as well as in some way make the patient forgive the lack of empathy of the parents. But in this process, analysis of hostility was ignored somehow by the analyst, assumed responsibility for having failed in being empathic. All of this was somehow caricaturized once in an international congress that I attended in Rome in 1989. I was a co-chair. No, I was in the audience, and there were two co-chairs. Betty Joseph, a Kleinian from London, and a self-psychologist from Chicago that I would not name. There was a case presentation. To begin with, when the two co-chairs entered the room, the Kochutian analyst came in, grabbed the microphone and put it in front of him and put it here, ignoring the co-chair to begin with. Then, when the case was being presented, after hearing the basic information about the case, the Chicago analyst asked the presenter, how did you manage to do what you did? Tell us, in what way did you empathize with the patient? And repeatedly cornered the presenter again and again. There you were, lacking of empathy. There you were, lacking of empathy. Again and again, like a broken record. Until the presenter, with very good sense of humor and also good spirit of criticism, asked him, in which way are you being empathic with me? Well, these are issues of the self-psychology that in some way I'm presenting in a rather caricature way somehow. But let's go to the end of it. And as you do remember, one of the famous papers that Heinz Kohut wrote was the two analyses of Mr. Z, in which he described two analyses. One, a classic Freudian analysis that ended up in failure, and the second analysis of Mr. C that was a Kohutian analysis, whereby the analyst Kohut was cast in the role of an empathic father that had been absent in the Freudian analysis, and in some way the Kohutian second analysis cured Mr. Z. As you know the complete history, it turned out that Mr. C was Kohut himself, and that the second analysis was indeed a self-analysis. And without being too cruel, you know that the big problem in self-analysis is countertransference. However, he not only distorted the reality of his having had himself a self-analysis of a second analysis and pretending to be a patient, but on the other hand created this mythology that with this quote new technique he had succeeded in curing Mr. Z. And there were many elements there that in some way become clarified by realizing the real identity of Mr. C. As you recall, Mr. C was in some way an incest victim of his mother. That is to say, Kohut himself. His mother had a peculiar type of quasi-perversion of taking her son naked and putting the son on her lap and looking for black spots in the son's skin and pinch them to remove the head of the black spot, and doing this systematically in nudity, in an intimate exchange, and with pain being inflicted, and with this special moment of naked intimacy between mother and son, that in some way speak of the dimension of his being victimized there by mother, and his being not only the possible victim of lack of empathy, but in some way chosen as the preferred one for these activities, and having the mixed message of being cast in the role of being selected as some kind of a partner in a sexualized, sadomasochistic, naked exchange of intimacy. This leads me, following again the trend to leave a little bit behind the paper we wrote in 1960, to remember how important it is that many analysts get into analysis after being in some way prisoners of their childhood. As Alice Miller described in her two books, The Drama of the Gifted Child and Prisoner of Childhood, among a large proportion of psychoanalysts that she interviewed, she found the antecedent of having been mother's confidant, of having had as the first person to treat, quote unquote, with psychological interventions her own or his own mother. That in some way then they became parentified, or we became the caretakers of our mothers, and through that we didn't have our own childhood, we were prisoners of our childhood, of this role of being the care provider of mother, the secret confidants, the preferred ones whose life was expected to be devoted to being mothering of our own mothers. This is a profile that in some way is repeated in the transference to the analyst, and in some way is not often analyzed with the depth and the attention that it deserves. and in some way leaves us in some way with these tremendous conflicted experiences in life, limited in spite of having been analyzed, but not perhaps sufficiently in these areas of sadomasochistically being victimized by a mother who used us as confidants and under the guise of giving us the privilege of sharing her suffering and her secrets, in some way trapped us as gifted children to take care, to become mothers of our own mothers. A dimension of a narcissistic contract that we grew up with our respective mothers, and that in some way may be very easily replicated between our training analysts and us, mainly so in small societies like the one I was trained in Chile with my own analysts that I wanted to devour in the 5 tomes of Cairo. Ambivalence becomes, in my mind, the backbone of, and the main root of our described conflicts in relationships among analysts. Ambivalence provokes easily our guilt or our need to accuse somebody else of aggression or being responsible for the lack of cohesiveness in our organizations. We don't have enough guts to acknowledge our own contribution to it. It leads us to defenses against aggression, often adopting scapegoating and naming someone to demonize inside or outside our group, and also organize ourselves as a secret society, in some way fighting the out-group as if it were necessarily our enemy, to which we have to defend ourselves, among other things, idealizing, almost divinizing, sacralizing at the very least the figure of Sigmund Freud and his theories, denying our research, our critics, our mixed feelings about them. It stimulates the projections of our bad qualities of one training analyst, our own, to other training analysts. Often the supervisors get the displaced denied transference that is not sufficiently analyzed with the training analyst, and it gets easily displaced toward the supervisor. I remember when I first came to Atlanta in January of '88, I got 2 supervisees that were in analysis with the same training analyst. Both were females. Clearly, I was the displaced figure of erotic transference with one of these 2 ladies, and I was the target of the hostility of the other lady, both elements that were underanalyzed in their respective analysis, as I have plenty of opportunity to verify. I couldn't say that my role was not being a supervisor of the training analyst, but supervising them. The ambivalence makes the relationship between student and teacher felt as omnipotent and may easily lead the teacher to abuse and impose him or herself over the candidate, like in the case of cohort analysts handing him the crown. If ambivalence is not tolerated and contained and in some way analyzed deeply, then the future analyst and his own training will become very limited and somehow ideally incomplete. In conclusion and suggestions, it's impossible to eliminate our aggression. It's part of us as our 4 members, 2 legs, 2 arms. It's impossible to eliminate frustration as part of life in social organizations. Edible impulses, adjacent impulses, Bill's group basic assumptions are part of human nature that we cannot jump out of our skin They cannot be eliminated, but yes, they can be analyzed. They should carry deeper analysis, not allow us to become pessimistic. We should find ways of integrating better our aggression and analyzing it. Thanatos is not alone. Eros is beside. Thanatos is together with Eros, hate with love. The task of the work group can relegate the basic assumption group mentality to the background and have democratically elected tasks that are carried on by democratic leadership, giving everybody opportunity to perform and have some status and satisfaction within the society. Possible solutions, they are not perfect either, but there may be deeper analysis of the pupil-master relationship, using more and more the theorization of envy in the transference, following the Kleinian theory of envy, that is the best and deepest that we have on that area. Probably training our candidates in part of their training also in group dynamics and group psychotherapy to become more able and skilled in dealing with the group dynamics and conscious. Perhaps a more democratic orientation in our organizations, including a promotion of real discussion in groups or seminars, rather than indoctrination by repeating or memorizing the dogmas. Also, keep in mind that the emotional tension and the difficulties that we are describing may increase our wish to understand them, to study them, to discuss more how to improve them rather than to act out. And perhaps avoid exaggerating, believing that our group is worse than any other group, or believing that all analysts we are crazy. Of course, we don't have omnipotent tools. However, we ended up this paper with Allenburg quoting a beautiful poem by our Chilean Nobel laureate Pablo Neruda, who wrote about human beings as follows: man is broader than the sea and its islands, and you have to drop inside of him like into a well to re-emerge from the depths with a branch of secret water and of submerged truths. And that is what I hope we may have contributed to with this study. Thank you.